I had one question based on your stories from last week, which was this girl who had that crush on you
Hmm.
and sort of awakened a sort of a Jewish identity awareness in you.
Hmm.
Have you ever talked to her again? Did you ever contact her
No, I
again?
never found her again. There was a brief period of time, like maybe 5, 6, 7 years ago, when there was this new Russian social network called Classmates in Russian, and that was a kind of craze. And I just decided to see what it was, and then basically that's what it was. The classmates, whoever could find you, like from first to 10th grade of school, and so I located several people there suddenly whom I hadn't thought in decades. And several of them were in Israel, and some of them knew her, and just tell them to say hi to her, but I'd never really communicated with her again.
Hmm.
Just know that she moved to Israel then, and then her whole life since that age of 16 transpired in Israel.
Yeah. What does it feel like when you reach out to these people who you haven't talked to since those days?
Well, you know, at first there is this great deal of excitement, but then you just think, well, but what do you do with it?
Hmm.
Just it kind of goes nowhere after a while, because after all, there was a reason why people's paths diverged. I have several, not many, very close friends going back decades. And one in particular, and then I have friends who are like from college days, and that's also decades. So there is a reason why friendships, keep going on, and sometimes they just go nowhere. Childhood is childhood, although of course, sometimes people think that those formative years, those childhood, is when we become what we are. And so I know somebody, a classmate or somebody who was in parallel grade, um, who several years ago, 5 or 6 years ago, again through that very apparently social network, found somebody who was my classmate, a young woman. Then she was a girl. Actually, she was a girl of like 8 years, so 8, 9, 10.
Hmm.
She was only with the in my school for a short while, and so that guy connected with her, and on the basis of the 3 years that they spent in that school on the outskirts of Leningrad, and both by that time, of course, were married and had children and grandchildren, and then they just changed the course of their lives completely, and then they just got together and got married. She was in Israel, he was back in St. Petersburg, and
Hmm.
so somehow they managed to get together again under the probably, what is that bond that forms between people when they're 7 or 8? It's not us, it's just different people somehow. But nonetheless, sometimes the attachment to one's nostalgia and one's memory, and memory is not real. Memory is nothing but imagination turned backwards. But the attachment to it is very strong, and people just decide that that's what was real in their lives, that was the real them, and that was the real time of their it's like Gabriel Garcia Marquez's life, Love in the Time of Cholera, where two people, just can reunite after being in love as teens, only in their 80s,
Hmm.
having had like numerous children, grandchildren, grandchildren, and so forth. But that was the only way for them to be together. So at the very end of their lives. So I don't know how. Um, Old friendships are not regenerable generally. Um, I have, however, several friends from my college days, and especially from my department, and especially from my, there were groups within the department called like by major, classes in Soviet universities and so forth. So with them, I maintain a kind of relationship when I went back to St. Petersburg with my literary programs there, and then they would even come once to Lithuania to visit me, and very different from me, people of non-international aspirations by and large at all. People who worked like a policeman, just hardly anyone worked as an engineer, as we were all trained to be. One worked as, as director of a factory that was doing something that's totally not related to our education and so forth. But in their case, I kind of, it kind of serves to measure the distance that you put between yourself and yourself, really, Well, I was one of them,
Mhm.
and now having circumnavigated the world, come back to the same place, and I'm not at all like them. But yet at the same time, I am, one's ability to remember one's own self is strong, and actually that self is kind of, there is an irreducible core. Just people go through many years of their lives and lots of different experiences, jobs, incarnations, relationships, heartbreak, happiness, illness, recuperation, and yet, and they change. And then my life had changed me beyond any of my imaginings when I was back in the Soviet Union, because I never thought I'd be writing in English, let alone be professor of English, let alone be writing in English, and let alone be teaching creative writing and so forth. Uh, but there is an irreducible core somehow, and that core is always with a person. No matter how many layers you peel away, there is something at the heart of one's being.
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely a question that I wanted to follow up with you based on so many of your stories, which is just you personally have many different identities wrapped up in your one core, as you're saying. And so how do you reconcile that? I mean, you have your Jewish identity, you still identify as a Russian man, but then you also lived a long time in America, and many of your social media posts are concerning American politics, and you're very involved in following those. And now you've lived here in Canada a long time. So what do you feel, how do you reconcile yourself with all these different
Well, the
perspectives?
short answer is I have no idea. I just imagine me lying down late at night. It's like, how do I reconcile my different identities? That's part of that irreducible core, somehow that all goes. Uh, you can be many different things in life, but there is something at the very center of your being that is you, I suppose. I I Jewish because in the Soviet Union, you were sort of like a designated Jew in the Soviet Union, because we were just the absolutely ordinary Soviet citizens, knowing no other language but Russian, being Russian in every single respect. Nobody knew Jewish history. Nobody knew Hebrew, or very old people knew Yiddish, but that was not encouraged. My parents were very much against my grandparents speaking in front of us or exchanging words in Yiddish, for instance.
Did you know any of the religious customs at
No,
all?
none at all. And that was actually since Soviet Union broke off diplomatic relationship with Israel when I was very young. Israel was considered an enemy country, and you couldn't study Hebrew, you couldn't study Jewish history. Actually, they were like underground circles, and you could go to jail for that, or you could get in serious trouble with the KGB. It was illegal, in other words. Imagine like.
Mm.
So, and nor did I have humongous amount of interest. When you are 16, you are issued your internal Soviet passport, which is the document that you have to carry on your persona at all times, which is basically like driver's license, except you're not driving, right? You have to have, and it's a little, it does look like a passport, but it's a little booklet with several pages, and on the first front page there is just basic information about you, right? Name, date of birth, and so forth. And on the fifth line, famously, ethnicity. And ethnicity, but not ethnicity, it's really in Russian, nationality. Here, nationality is understood like Canadian, American, right?
Right.
But in Russia, it's just basically it's who you're by blood. Just so, and in my case, it was just said very Jew, Simply because my parents were Jewish and their parents were Jewish. If even one of them, even one of grandparents, for instance, were not Jewish, then you had the right to be listed as not Jewish.
Really?
But yeah, but in my case, it was it was like throughout like just Jews.
Right.
Just and so and of course the realization of that, and I wrote a story about that. It's called Necessary Evil and was published in Guernica magazine online, precisely about my recollection about having this news broken to me by my parents, like when I was about 8 years of age. They knew that sooner or later, and sooner rather than later, the world would make me aware of that, and so they decided to preempt that trauma. And it was a very traumatic experience, because by that time one already hears really a big deal, like huge amount of negative stuff about Jews and how they aim to destroy Russia and take advantage of the gullible and kind-hearted Russians, and how Jews always are just aiming to harm the people who surround them, and they only, the usual Eastern European anti-Semitic stuff.
Right. And then you find out that you are.
Yeah, and suddenly I am one of them.
Right.
I had no idea. I was like, what do I do? And I go, well, we're just like everybody else. And it's like, no, but what if we don't even know? Like it's like a bat doesn't know it's a bat. A wolf doesn't know it's a wolf. What if we don't know? We think that we're good people, but what if we're horrible people?
Can you remember resenting it when you were really young, when they did this to
Well,
you?
I was upset. That's what the story is about. And of course, after that, I lived in Leningrad, which is the second largest city, and there were about 2 million people with the same Jew in their passport in the Soviet Union. And they, of course, almost all of them were in Moscow or Leningrad, or big cities that were still part of the Soviet Union then, like Kiev, like Odessa in particular, where, they started being depopulated very rapidly after 1973, when massive Jewish emigration started, especially from those kind of places, from the periphery of the Soviet Empire, from the Soviet Union, but in the Soviet Union as well. But as I mentioned, there was never a question that we would be able to, our family, because of my father, to do that. So I was resentful mainly. When you're very young, when you're little, you're resentful, like, because why me? Just why us?
Right.
And they were like, why not us? Just that's a stupid question. Some people, are born like tall and athletic and good looking, and some people are born like short and awkward and maybe with club foot, or like a hair lip. Like, it's just a lottery.
Yeah.
If you're prepared to draw a lucky lottery ticket in life, you should be just as prepared to draw an unlucky one, right? So somebody has to be a Jew. And if somebody has to, then why not us? It's just, you can either allow yourself to fall apart because of that, or just to spend your life being resentful and wallowing in self-pity, or conversely, you can turn it into a motivating factor, and then, just because, frankly, they told me, in order to be on a par with other students everywhere, you would have to work twice as hard, because the system would be against me. So you could consider yourself even lucky, because it was a motivating factor. But I still was not very happy. And then they came up with some kind of idea that Jews were put in the world in order to, like, serve as the canary, in English expression, canary in the mine shaft, like sort of like allowing people to vent their anger, just being like the outlet for human anger. And when you're like 8 or 9, like, that's total crap,
Right. Yeah.
So so at first you were resentful, but then you get used to it, and you get used to daily anti-Semitism. I think the main difference, one of the big differences between North American Jews, U.S., Canada, and let's say Eastern European Jews under the age of 50, let's say, is that North American Jews, quite frankly, never faced like direct, open anti-Semitism, But in Soviet Union or in Soviet Republic, of course, people shouting in your face all the time, and then sometimes they want to beat you up for that. Those kinds of things. So you live in the atmosphere of official anti-Semitism.
Mm.
And then, of course, as I mentioned, I couldn't go to university, but so there were those kinds of fluctuations. But like with everything else, you get used to living with it, just to being something. And of course, in the circle of friends and the circle generally in a wide circle of friends and acquaintances, that actually was one of the kind of dividing lines in the sand, how us recognized not us, just that was one of the all my friends and all my girlfriends have always been Russian, because just I was Russian for all intents and purposes. Just the passport said otherwise, and my appearance was, Russians are uncannily good at immediately recognizing a Jewish appearance, or generally, so I look Jewish. So, but otherwise, anti-Semitism was sort of like one of the kind of major defining factors. If somebody, in a mixed company somewhere made like vaguely even anti-Semitic reference, he was cut off from our group of people forever. Just even Russians were, my Russian friends and acquaintances were even more like anti-Semitic, like absolutely vehement against it. Like Vladimir Nabokov, who was not Jewish, because it basically defines the soul of the nation. So they just sensed that was, I was kind of more used to it than they were, as a matter of fact, here and there. So, but certainly it created the sense of being an outsider to some extent. And also it created the sense of that you belong to the only group of people who legally can leave the Soviet Union, except not in my case, because my father got himself enmeshed in this tremendously secret kind of, research work.
Right.
And so, you always felt that you were in a slightly different situation, a slightly different position, because, an outsider, even though, by nature I'm an insider, and I was part of the underground literary community. There it didn't really matter at all, because there we lived in non-Soviet society in that underground literary community. But otherwise, it is an interesting notion, and I think that actually is characteristic of many Eastern European Jews. Throughout history, you realize yourself being Jewish via negativa, by overcoming the loathing of large number of people who want to see you dead, even not knowing who you are, having just as a matter of principle, they don't think you should exist. So that's a bracing notion, and that's that's what makes you realize that you're Jewish, because other people want you gone. But and of course that does not relate to the young generation of people in Israel, for instance, have none of that, obviously, because why? That's kind of stupid, it's their country, right? Or religious Jews, they observant, deeply observant Jews, they don't pay attention to that nonsense either, just it's the rest of the world doesn't exist for them. By the way, if I go like through Outremont, through Fairmont, which there are streets that are Fairmont, for instance, that were heavily, Hasidic Jews on both sides of the street. They don't think, they look, and they speak Yiddish primarily.
Right.
They look right through me. They don't consider me a Jew, no more than anybody else in this building, because I don't speak Yiddish and I don't share their faith. And so there are many aspects to it. But then just yesterday, for instance, I online on Twitter, it was a minor splash in U.S. newspapers. There is this rock musician, like completely washed out but famous in the 70s, Ted Nugent, right?
Yes,
yeah, very, very,
very conservative guy.
Not only conservative, but he's a wacko with Second Amendment, especially, right? He just whatever moves, he will try to shoot it, basically, because he just loves his guns. So he posted on his Facebook, and it's on his Facebook. He's proud of it, basically. He posted photographs of all the prominent Jews Democrats and posted like Star of David next to their face and say, these are our enemies, they're against Second Amendment, look at this mother just and remember who they are. These are our enemies. And then, of course, Anti-Defamation League just kicks into action, just says that's this anti-Semitism and newspapers in Israel. So, but Ted Nugent is completely unfazed. But what does he care?
Yeah.
He's completely crazy, essentially. But what is impressive there is when you go on that Facebook post and there are like 3,000 comments, right, or however many, 5,000 comments, like thousands and thousands. 90% of them, gas ovens are waiting for you, Jews. And these are just people list their occupation, tech support at such and such. They,
they're not ashamed at all.
No, not at all.
Yeah.
Why would they be ashamed? They think they're right. But they're not ashamed. But they, you can look them up. You can befriend them. I don't have common friends with any of them. Although it took me like 10 minutes and I couldn't read any further. But right on, Ted. Time to take care of them, Jews. Those kinds of things. So very much alive and well in America.
Yeah.
And going out on a huge limb in Canada as well, I would imagine. Anywhere. So,
but I mean, I would imagine that you probably feel that it's always been there. It's just now they have Facebook to
it's always been there because I grew up in Eastern Europe, and because I go to, and my deep ancestry is from Lithuania and Belarus, and I go there periodically, and I know that it's huge trauma, and it's always there. It's always been there. It's been there for centuries, for many centuries. So of course it would take a long period. It's a trauma that's in the heart of humanity, more or less. It's like slavery is trauma in the heart of American society.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah,
I remember you telling me a story last year in a class I took with you that I think you said you were in Lithuania for an SLS seminar, and some man came up and asked if you were Steven Spielberg and what you really took away.
Oh, that was a different story. That's complaining. I was actually in Tampa, Florida.
Oh, okay. So it was right there in America then.
Tampa, Florida.
Yeah.
But that was the guy who meant no harm. On the contrary, he probably wanted. I teach in law residency program at the University of Tampa,
right?
And I'm with several friends of mine. It's a great program, so I go there twice a year for sessions, and the rest of the time it's all online, correspondence and so forth, critique and book annotations and stuff. So with my students from previous semester, they say, well, let's go have dinner, and we go to like a moderate restaurant/bar somewhere near the not far from campus, but it's crowded. It's football night, and it's like weekend night, and there were like lots of people, or like it's Friday night. So so I'm sitting there, and then there is this corporate looking guy, like in button down shirt, Oxford, just shirt, and so it's like looking like he might be working at a bank or something like that, just right. So he keeps just casting glances at me and just looking at me, and I'm just like, whatever. But then he just clearly, having just gathered like the nerve, he just comes up to our table and says, I'm terribly sorry, I really don't want to interfere, but I just have to ask, right? Are you Steven Spielberg? And of course, everybody, I would have told them, of course I am, but the students, of course, I were just completely rolling on the floor by that. They said, well, if you would like to think of me as Steven, I certainly wouldn't mind. Just it's like a couple $1 billion more wealthier I would be, probably. Said, oh, that's too bad, because I have a screenplay. So it's just like, I work in a firm, but in my spare time so I said, look, even if I were Steven Spielberg, I probably wouldn't take a look at your screenplay, because I just wouldn't have time to look at your screenplay.
That's true.
So it was hilarious in a way, but then as we were leaving, and it was students, and I crossed paths, and I told it to this friend of mine and colleague here, Josip Novakovic, and then said, I was laughing and said, do you not realize what he was saying to you? And of course, I look nothing like Steven Spielberg, for better or worse.
Yeah.
Also, Steven Spielberg is older than me by like 10 years, but then maybe he takes good care of himself. But But don't you realize he basically was he saying he didn't say that you are look like Steven Spielberg. He said you look Jewish, basically.
Yeah.
Just Jewish Jewish appearance. You know, like how do you know? Like like it's like
So
yeah.
he was just profiling you, and how? I mean,
Yeah, but
you say
with
it
the
means
best
no
of
harm,
intentions, he had a screenplay,
right?
and he also couldn't believe he's. I also don't look. Chances are, if I were Steven Spielberg, I might not have been having dinner at this bar in Tampa.
Would have been a great story for him, though. That's how his screenplay got
yeah,
made.
but it wouldn't be my first choice of an establishment. Why? It's like this talk radio, this old movie with Eric Bogosian, where it's like he answers late night phone calls from people, and there are all kinds of crackpots calling, and one of them is just like I'm Jesus. I've come to and it's just like, okay, Jesus, all right, but if you're Jesus, why are you in Cincinnati? It's like. Jesus came to Cincinnati.
It's also only up at 1:30 in the morning.
Yeah, it's just not the first choice. Probably would be for Jesus, Cincinnati. So, yeah, yeah.
I mean, I think it's remarkable that you're able to sort of laugh that off and recognize that he means no harm. But I mean, it just compounds into something for you. Doesn't
Well, I
it?
would imagine anybody who gets profiled by yeah. Yeah, it doesn't offend me. I'm used to it somehow. But back in the Soviet Union, when you're a child, and when somebody in the courtyard, like or somewhere, some kids say, "Hey, you Jew or kike," and so forth, those are fighting words, and you know that you have to fight, basically, and it's, I was pretty good at that, although I was always very small, but I was very, very athletic when I was hard as it may be to believe, but yeah, when somebody calls you that and you are a child, but after that, after you go into like grown up life, it's just official anti-Semitism. They just tell you, for instance, like, no, we can't hire Jews, those kinds of things. So, or more delicately, they say we cannot take people with your last name or something like that.
Have you had that said to you?
Oh, many times.
Really?
Oh, of course. Yeah, that was the period when I was after graduation from college. We were all sent to different places to work for 3 years, and it was mandatory. And because I was a good student, I was left in Leningrad and went to work at this research institute, which basically was again submarine screening. I was a very indifferent engineer, and my efforts to screen Soviet submarines from detection were not 100% successful, as we can see. And I was just constantly looking for ways to, but I had to stay there for 3 years. But after a certain point, when I just decided, when I met people, like there were several Americans who came to Leningrad, and I met them, and I thought, well, why can't I be there? Why? And so. And I just decided to pursue this further, despite what my father had said that maybe I would be able to leave. So I found a way to leave that research institute after 2 years out of the mandatory 3. In a fairly some other time, I'll tell you how I managed to accomplish that, because in and of itself it also was kind of hilarious. But then I went to work to a place that was like distributing cement to different factories in the Leningrad region, and there was no clearance there. There was no secrecy there. Basically, it was. And then, but very quickly from there, after I applied to immigrate and was turned down in my application, then I had no choice but to just go down to the very lowest rung of the social ladder, because that's where the KGB couldn't get you, essentially. Nobody else would. And so I went to different places, just like boiler rooms, and just where, all those kinds of places where they needed security guards. That's where my generation of underground writers worked anyways. And in most of those places, they would say, "Well, you understand, you're grown up. We can't take Jews, or we cannot take people with your last name." I said, "Sure, I understand. It's not their personal anti-Semitism. It's just they can't." So the reason why they couldn't in many places because they were afraid that somebody would apply to emigrate, or especially if you had already applied, that basically you're taking on like enemies of the state or traitors to the motherland. Like, what does it say about you?
Hmm.
It's not good.
It went that far, eh? That they, I mean, even if you were applying to emigrate, they didn't want to be affiliated with your disloyalty.
Well, after you applied to immigrate and then you were turned down and told that you're leaving the country at this point would be contravenous to the interests of the state, which was the standard formulation. Of course, you became sort of kind of radioactive because you essentially you shown your hand. You basically revealed yourself as an anti-Soviet element.
But
Because
how would a place like a boiler room know that you had? I mean, would it be stamped on your passport that you had
yeah,
tried?
of course, I told you about the passport. It's
Yeah, yeah.
fifth line. It just says right there, Jew.
But did it show that you had already applied to emigrate, or was it just the fact that you could emigrate at all that they were?
Oh, they would know immediately. First off, they would if they would become even marginally serious about hiring you, they would call the KGB.
Oh, so just a simple background.
They would just
check
simply
and-
immediately call the KGB with the KGB. But the KGB office was basically at every place of employment in the Soviet Union. Every research institute, every factory, so they had party committee, and then they had the first department, as it was called, but it was a KGB outlet. It's just an outlet. So, and there is a sitting person who, of course, has access to everyone's files and so forth. So, in order to, but that more often than not, it wouldn't even go that far. First off, they see that you are an educated person, you're an engineer, right? And with a diploma, with the high grades and so forth, and just your electromagnetic fields, you're a major. Why are you trying to become
Right,
a
it's
security
already
guard?
suspicious,
What's wrong
yeah.
with you? And it doesn't. It's not rocket science for them. So,
what does it mean to be Jewish to you now in your adult years?
I'm not an observant Jew, but I'm keenly mindful of being Jewish, and periodically I would go to the temple, but not often. Part of it manifests itself in, well, for instance, I'm a U.S. citizen, and that's why I feel I have the right to write about American politics, whatever I believe and feel. For 30 years of my life, I was a Soviet citizen, right? And so I still consider that place to be like a place where I'm from, obviously, because that's where I lived my first life. And so I feel very comfortable writing what I think about what's going on there now. Even though I have to be somewhat temperate and periodically I have to remind myself that I no longer live there, and there are friends of mine who do live there, and so they have it much harder. But with this, but for instance, I find it much more problematic for me to be very critical of Israel, even though I disapprove of the occupation. For instance, I generally disapprove of Netanyahu policies at all. And of course, that is also to a certain extent the consequence of the fact that at least 1/4 and probably more of the population of Israel are recent emigres from the Soviet Union who are extremely conservative because it's people with a Soviet mentality. They just replace pluses with minuses in their head, but they're completely intolerant. That's us. That's the Soviet people. So of course, they're the base of support for the hard right government. Of course, they would support any, for them it's black and white and nothing in between. Essentially, it's just the word compromise is a dirty word for a Soviet citizen. So, but I feel that and I was asked about that. Why do you not write anything? Because because I know what anti-Semitism is like, and it exists everywhere. And I'm not a citizen of Israel, and I don't want uh, to criticize. I can say critical words about Netanyahu and his government, but generally I don't want to contribute to the general atmosphere of anti-Semitism. And I feel that there is a lot of it. There is a lot of it, and because I feel that a lot of movements like BDS, for instance, boycott this and so forth, Israel, very often it's just a very thin veneer for legitimized anti-Semitism, especially in Europe, and where recently I posted something on Facebook, article from New York Times or CNN, something just showing graphs how Jews in France are living in record numbers, basically 25% of them like leaving just now, because it's become dangerous and difficult for them to be Jewish in the changing demographics and so forth. So I post that with basically without a comment, just post, and soon thereafter I get posted on my timeline just as in a comment to that, like, well, you shouldn't have them European white people should have thought harder about letting out all these animals from Africa and Asia, and I just say, well, and then the person just signs herself proudly director of this kind of white history pride organization, something like that, with a link. She provides a link to it, and there are like lots of swastikas there, and say like, I'm going to ban you in 2 minutes just for you to internalize the message that I loathe and despise anti-Semites and bigots. And she just exploded in caps locks the very next minute, like, die, Jew scum. This kind of victory will be ours. We will kill you still, and so forth. And also, I remember, but they're there.
Yeah.
They're there. They're everywhere, more or less. So it's there is a lot of anger, and it's a very difficult world we live in. So it's still, my identities are constantly. The steadiest identity that I always had, and the steadiest relationship I always had, was one with language, essentially. Russian language, which was something that was the most important thing for me in the world, and then and now English, which is not my native language, but it's just that's the attachment that kind of pulls me through life. Essentially, that's the thread that I attach myself to. Being Jewish is just a very important fact of life, something that defines me and reminds me constantly that still that there are people who hate you just because the world is that you're still a stranger. Very often you're an outsider, even though it's easy to forget. This problem doesn't exist. For instance, my daughter went to Bialik High School, which is one of the oldest Jewish schools. It's not a religious school, but a very Jewish school here in Montreal, and and she was very happy there, and I was very happy that she went there, and so she knows history, of course. She knows Hebrew. She knows Yiddish. Not that she's tremendously interested in that anymore, but that's she wouldn't understand if I were to tell her, which I don't feel like telling her that. When if you had been born in the Soviet Union, your life would have been very, very different. Instead of going to Bialik school, you would be, you'd be given lists of places where you could go apply after high school. So,
do you think that might make her more susceptible to getting hurt by anti-Semitism later on in life, though?
But I don't think that she is aware. She's they've been told extensively about the Holocaust, and she knows all of that.
Mm-hmm.
But fortunately, she lives in a place where she doesn't have to deal with it on a personal level. Unless you look for it, unless you befriend Ted Nugent in that case.
Well, yeah, but I mean, you're saying even...
Ted Nugent accepts, by the way, friends' requests.
Yeah. Yeah, the greater the audience he has, the better, the happier he is. But I mean, even you were just saying, I mean, you share something on your own Facebook profile, which means this is somebody that you must be friends with or must somehow already be following your posts. So it's within a circle of people that you've accepted as a friend, and then they identify themselves as someone who's a crazy anti-Semite.
But I don't get that, because even despite the fact that we have however many friends, and I have like 5,000 because of all these programs and a bunch of subscribers, uh, basically very quickly Facebook like segments you somehow, and you don't really, if I were to go and post something, let's say on Donald Trump supporters wall somewhere, that's when you are, but basically people stay within their domains, so I'm pretty certain that I don't have like open anti-Semites amongst my Facebook friends.
Okay.
And I don't think that the rabid anti-Semites like Ted Nugent fans would somehow, who is primarily about guns anyways, so he doesn't care about much of anything else. So if I were to go into that domain, then of course I would expose myself. But indeed, sometimes when you post something that touches upon someone's nerve, like in this case of this crazed woman, who, by the way, went to the University of Oxford and lives in Hawaii, she's not shy about that at all. She's a researcher at Hawaiian Institute who just writes on someone's wall, like, and has a website with swastikas.
Wow.
That's and she writes like "Die Jews come," just this, and then she goes probably to classroom, and then
That's right. That was between two classes. Yeah.
So I don't know. It's a complicated issue, but I have to say that when I was growing up, by and large, none of my friends were anti-Semites. It was always the outside world, but you always have a system of support. You always have a core of friends who don't. It was among educated, normal people in Russia. It was not even an issue, as it is not in North America. But there are always crazy people,
Right.
because there are lots of people in the world. That's why.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
And they'll always be loudest with their opinions. So.
Yeah. But the world is so large, and even the world of social networks is so large, what we barely come into, So when this group Anonymous started unveiling the Ku Klux Klan members,
Right.
they turned out to be lots of them.
Yeah.
And they maintain Facebook accounts, and they're not ashamed of the fact that they're KKK. But then it turned out that one of them got fired, and he was like, "Why?" His employer was just, so it's not like he was not a highly skilled worker. He worked in a restaurant.
Yeah.
And it's probably bad publicity for a restaurant.
I hope so.
Yeah. So yeah, that's that.